In the second video, before we really get into the brain and what's broken with addictions, there's a couple of concepts that we really need to understand. One is, what is an addiction? And the other one is some of the philosophies and concepts that are out there that can sabotage our attempts at success. Okay? Especially the concept of whether addiction is a sin, which is like a moral failure, or a disease of the brain. And why is that so important? Is because as you see it, you will treat it. For example, if addiction is just a sin, then of course the way to get over your addiction is just repent. And doing this for over 30 years now, I work with people that have repented thousands of times, and it didn't work. So there has to be something more that's involved. Okay? So first of all, let's look at what is an addiction. Basically, an addiction is an habitual coping behavior. And what an addiction really is it's when we continue to do a self-destructive behavior in spite of the consequences and don't stop. In other words, why would anyone continue to do something that they know is not good for them and then continue to do it? Well, you know what that's called? That's called insanity. People who are self-destructive, they put them in mental hospitals, aren't they? But really, under that definition, I haven't met anyone who doesn't have an addiction. Because we all do things that we know is not good for us. But then we continue to do them anyway. Well, why don't we just stop it? That doesn't make sense. And the second term is the term recovery, which is so overused now it's really lost its meaning. And most people confuse recovery with abstinence. Recovery is not abstinence. Abstinence, or not doing the chemical or the behavior, is just the first step. What recovery really is, if you look it up in the dictionary, what it means is to return to a former healthy state. And this is important because it's one of the foundations of Genesis. That we're not trying to become a new person. We're trying to become the person we were before we got hurt and wounded and then started using some kind of coping behavior which became an addiction in order to cope with those wounds. So recovery is not to become somebody new. It's to return to a former healthy state, the person you were before you had to find a way to cope with life, which became an addiction. So let's look at what the Bible has to say about this phenomenon of addiction and this controversy of sin or disease. In James, chapter 1, verse 13, James says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone." Okay? But what he says is that each one is tempted when he is carried away, enticed by his own lust. Especially in Christian circles, is lust a sin? When I do this in seminars, people say, oh yeah, lust is a sin. But lust isn't a sin. Lust is just an emotion. I could have a lust for righteousness. That's not a sin. But what lust is a strong desire for something. So what James is telling us, we all have temptation every day. To be honest, with sex, pornography, drugs, alcohol, so many things that we're tempted with every day. But so that's not going to go away. We're all tempted. But what happens is when we dwell on that temptation and we fantasize about it, then that temptation turns into a strong emotion, which is called lust, which is a strong desire. Now, if we do this for very long, which is, really a bad choice, is to dwell on these things, that bad choice, what James says, is that when lust, the strong desire, is conceived, it gives birth to sin, a bad choice. Of course, this is part of the brain thing that we realize is once desire or an emotion, gets to a certain degree, that the part of your brain that actually has consequences actually shuts down. And so you see people when they start to relapse, they're so focused with this craving that they really don't care anymore about the consequences to themselves and to others, and they just have to go do the very thing they don't want to do. Now, it says that when this strong desire, we give into it, when we dwelled on it, and then we act on it, then it becomes a sin, which is action. And then he says that when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death or disease. So, looking at this, very briefly, so we're tempted, then when we dwell on that temptation, which is really a bad choice, then we become powerless and we give in to it, and it brings forth sin. But the consequences of sin is disease and death. For example, is smoking a sin? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. But the Bible tells us, he that knows the right thing to do, James again, okay, and does it not, to him is it a sin. So everybody knows smoking is not the right thing to do. It's a bad choice, isn't it? But then is lung cancer a sin? No, it's a consequence of sin. Another one so prevalent in our society today is, what about food? Gluttony. Is gluttony a sin? Well, the Bible tells, yeah, gluttony is a sin. But is diabetes a sin? No, diabetes is the result of sin. And it's the same way with addiction. Okay? Addiction is the result of bad choices and actions, which is sin. And the way the addiction becomes a disease, and what a disease really is, a disease is just something where an organ doesn't work right. When you have a heart disease, it means that your heart isn't working right, or your liver. So when your brain doesn't work right, in the same way, it's diseased. And what happens is, with addiction, is that you, from these bad choices, okay, in habitual sin, that your brain becomes diseased. And what happens to it is it creates a craving, or a false craving, for non-survival behaviors and substances that are usually self-destructive. So we'll get into in the next video about what this phenomenon of craving is. But you see, now my brain, instead of craving things that are good for me, okay, it craves things that are destructive for me. And a craving is a unique emotion, you understand. Craving is only produced where real or imagined survival is at stake. So through these bad choices, our brain now focuses on drugs or alcohol or, sex or other destructive behaviors, and it craves them as if they were survival behaviors. In other words, we can't live without it. And why does it do that? Because the brain has become polluted, more or less. It has become changed, and it becomes diseased. So it's important to understand this, because the disease concept tells you that there are things you can do, just like diabetes, okay, to keep your disease in remission, and there are things you can do to cause it to be reactivated. And that's where the relapse prevention is understanding, and it doesn't eliminate the consequences of the choices that I've made, okay? But now that I've made those bad choices, I have to be able to deal with those consequences, which is an addictive brain. Now, we'll end with this, is that one of the arguments against the disease concept of addiction is this, is that, well, lung cancer is a disease, and you just can't, choose not to have lung cancer, but you could choose to stop drinking. That's true. You can choose to stop drinking, but you can't choose not to be an alcoholic anymore. See? And so that's an important, understanding of this disease concept. Okay? Now, in the next video, we're going to look at the brain and this unique emotion on how the brain becomes distorted and creates cravings for things that are bad for us, and look at not only how it happens, but what it takes to change and heal. Okay, I'll see you in the next video, part 2 of What's Broken.